We've got just a few pretty simple and pretty brief lessons this week. So this week will be kind of a light social studies week, just finishing up some stuff with the geography and world history section of the GEE, and then we'll spend Thursday just reviewing some things, and then next week way back to the beginning of social studies and kind of reboot everything, and there'll be a few new lessons right at the beginning that we haven't done, but then eventually we'll get into kind of going around the through the same topics again, hopefully talking about some new stuff, but a lot of it will be review if you've been doing classes from the beginning. And with that in mind, if you have been doing classes from the beginning, make sure you're taking practice tests every couple weeks to see if you're indeed ready to take some tests, because if you've been to all the classes, you should be trying to push your way out of here and not having to do too many more. With that said, let me pull up today's lesson. Again, it's probably going to run a little bit on the short side, but I just want to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about these last few sections. And today's section just talks about humans and the environment, and just kind of some basic terms, nothing real complicated or in-depth, just kind of how humans interact with their environment and impact the environment. And then tomorrow we'll spend some time talking about conservation and sustainable use of resources and different energy sources, and some things that we've actually talked about in science where there's a little bit of an overlap. But today I just want to talk about this slide here, and then we'll jump to some practice questions. So when we are talking about humans and the environment, there's some terms that I kind of want to identify or define. The first is population. When we are talking about population as it pertains to social studies, we're talking about the number of inhabitants of a particular area, region, or town. In science, we go even further to define population as dependent on not only the place, which it says there, right, but also the time period. In other words, population implies a specific time. In other words, the present population of a city, of a county, of a state, of a country means how many people are living there today, right now. Right? Whereas, if you specify what it was the population of Spokane in 1900, that implies something also specific, right? So population is, as it says there, the number of inhabitants of a particular area, region, or town. It's said you can define the boundary of how many of the area that you're talking about, right? We can be talking about the population of the world, right? But you have to specify an area, and you really should specify a time frame. And if there isn't a time frame specified, then it should be implied that we're talking about present. Okay. So as it pertains to populations of people, right? We use terms like native population or migrant population to define people that either, in the case of native populations, people that are indigenous to that area. In other words, born in that same town or country or state or whatever, right? Native means they were born there, grew up there, stayed there. Whereas migrant, and some of this stuff might be obvious, and some of it might not be, but a migrant population is populations of people that are traveling from somewhere else to a new location, right? So if we're talking about the United States, the native population is the people that were born and raised in the United States. The migrant population is people that weren't, people that came from other places, moved to the United States, right, to live there, and are currently residing there, right? So those are kind of the two different groups when we talk about populations, native and migrant. And then some of this stuff here, when we talk about population distribution of any society, right, or any country, right, that's basically talking about the resources, jobs, political situations, climate, and economic development, and all those things are possible factors of population distribution. So what population distribution is where are people living, okay? So really, we kind of lump population distribution into three groups, and you've probably heard these terms. Again, this is why we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, because it's pretty straightforward, right? But we have urban populations, rural populations, and suburban. Urban meaning the people that are living in cities and towns. Rural, people that are living outside of the towns, you know, typically farmlands or lands adjacent to forest or wilderness, right? But further removed from people, right? Or less densely populated. And then suburban populations are the kind of in between, right? Populations in or near, or not in, but near or adjoining to urban areas, right? So suburban areas are kind of a newer area of population distribution because that wasn't always the case, right? But we have large areas of suburban population, especially in the United States, where you have cities getting so big or expensive, and you have people spreading into the adjoining area, right? And basically developing it up into kind of widespread housing and commercial development, right? So if you look at the picture over here, right, we have obviously an urban setting, and then down in the bottom we have a rural setting, and then in the middle that's kind of an example of, you know, what suburb might look like, right? Places that maybe were once rural areas but were converted into areas where you have big neighborhoods or people living, and there's high population density, but it's not necessarily urban. Okay? I feel like we don't need to go into that too much, but again, all of those different factors factor into where people choose to live, right? It could be resources, money, right? It could be jobs, right? People tend to live in or near where they work, right? So if you have opportunities to have a job somewhere in the city, you might live in the city, maybe a suburb. You're probably not going to live in rural areas. And if you're a farmer, you're probably not going to live in the city, right? And then also political situations, political, you know, viewpoints, the climate of the area, all those things factor into where people choose to live or maybe don't choose, right? Or maybe they are forced to live. And then the kind of last term that we'll talk about before we jump into the practice questions for the day is pollution, which is a pretty straightforward thing, right? As populations grow, manufacturing increases, and urbanization also increases. All these things lead to potential contamination of land, air, and water. Very straightforward. So with that said, let's jump into the practice questions and spend a little more time on them than we normally do. And whenever we get through the questions, we'll call it a day and pick up where we left off tomorrow. Sound good? So let me stop this here and pop up. All right, so let's take a look at what we got today. So I'll zoom in so we can read them. Tomorrow's lesson. There we go. There. Those are the questions. Okay. So number one just simply says, what is migration? A form of society in which people move on after they consume an area's resources. B, temporary travel to another geographic region to scout for resources. C, the move of an individual or population from one geographic area to settle in another. Or D, the relative distribution of populations in urban and rural areas. So remember, migration, or we didn't specifically talk about migration. When we talked about migrant versus native, remember, native populations or people that were born there and raised there and still live there, and migrant populations are populations of people that have come from somewhere else to Okay, so with that in mind, then the two easy ones to throw away here are A and D. A form of society in which people move on after they consume an area's resources. And D, the relative distribution of population in urban and rural areas. Neither of those tie into specifically talking about where people have come from or how they ended up where they're living, right? So what we're left with is really only a choice between B and C. Right? Temporary travel to another geographic region, or C, the move of an individual or population from one area to settle in another. Okay, and the key words here that really give it away are temporary versus settle, right? So temporary implies what, right? Obviously that it's not permanent, right? Or long-term even, right? Because you can live somewhere without the notion of it being permanent, but temporary travel implies you're just going somewhere for a little bit and then you're leaving, right? So that's not really migration. Migration implies that you're moving somewhere to live there, right? So the word settle, means to pack up and move and go somewhere and call that your home, right? Or however long as you're planning to live. So really here, the only and best answer choice is move of an individual. Migration can be one person, but more typically when we talk about migration, we're talking about larger numbers of people from one area to settle in another. So that's pretty straightforward. This next question is maybe a little bit more complicated, so let's take a little closer look. Number 2 says, migration within a country's borders is called internal migration. Which of the following is an example of internal migration? Okay, so migration in general is just coming from a different geographic area to live in another geographic. But it says here, internal migration is specifically migrating from somewhere else within the country to some new place, right? So if you were coming from Florida and you were moving to Spokane, that would be an example of internal migration. Okay? So we just have to identify which of these 4 is an example of internal migration. Pretty straightforward. A, the movement of the Irish to the United States during the potato famine in the 1800s. B, the westward movement of the American population in the 1700s to the present. C, the movement of Mexican workers into the Southwest United States during the 1900s. Or D, the movement of people from former British colonies to Great Britain. Okay, so let's break this down. The answer choices are kind of weird, and the right answer may sound obvious, but it may not, because the way it's worded, it doesn't necessarily clearly state. So let's look at some ones that very easily we could throw out. A, the movement of the Irish to the United States during the potato famine. So you're coming from Ireland to the United States, from another country to the United States. Not internal migration. Internal migration has to be within the same country. So A doesn't make sense. Same thing with C. The movement of Mexican workers, people coming from Mexico, into the southwestern United States. From Mexico to the United States, not internal migration. So we're left with B and D. The westward movement of the American population from the 1700s to the present, or D, the movement of people from former British colonies to Great Britain. Okay, so the word that gives this away, even if the right answer doesn't seem obvious to you, maybe the right answer does, but the reason that D isn't correct is because it says the movement of people from former British colonies to Great Britain. Right? If it had said the movement of people from British colonies to Great Britain, that you might have a case for being an example of internal migration. But it says former, which means they are no longer British colonies, and they are now moving to Great Britain. That wouldn't be an example of internal migration because of that, right? That makes sense? So the best answer, and the one we're left with, is B, the westward movement of the American population from the 1700s to the present. Now, it doesn't specifically say that migration is happening within the United States, but it implies it. So we have to know a little bit about what the westward movement of America was in order to answer that question. So that's an example where you have to have a little bit of knowledge about the topic, right? That is, as the United States acquired more territory and became larger, people started moving slowly west, right? Because the original 13 colonies are all along the East Coast. So as our country grew, people slowly moved west and west and west. That's what it's talking about. All right. So stop me if I'm going too fast or if I'm wasting too much time. Mention that too. Either way. I'm just pulling up my chat and I see that Caleb was up. That was a perfect example. I did not necessarily mean to use you as an example, but there you go. So let's look at number 3 here. So we're just going to do these last 4 questions, and if we end up being done early, then that's fine with me today. So number 3 says urban areas blank suburban areas. Okay. So let's look at our answer choices and see which of these make sense. Okay, urban areas, 1, are more densely populated than suburban areas. 2, urban areas have been more recently settled than suburban areas. 3, urban areas contain more remnants of farms than suburban areas. Or 4, urban areas have more agricultural workers than suburban. Okay, so again, because they don't give us a lot here, we just have to go with the one that makes the most sense and the one that is maybe least disputable, because you could maybe argue some of these others. So you just have to go with the clearest one that makes the most logical sense, right? So I'd get rid of have been more recently settled than, because suburban areas are newer than urban areas, right? Suburban areas have only existed since really the 40s and 50s, and maybe into the 60s, when we have a big boom in the South. And I don't want to talk too much about that because of the next question. But anyway, urban areas are much older than suburban areas, so I'm going to throw that out. And also, I would probably throw out contain more remnants of farms than suburban. Because if suburban areas were once rural areas, it would make sense that they would have more old farms kind of left over. So really, the only one that makes sense, if we think about cities, we think about suburbs, right? What's the best answer choice here? Probably the first one, right? That urban areas are more densely populated than suburban. Cities are packed in, people are more packed in cities, and there's more people. So the first one makes the most sense for an answer choice, speaking generally about urban versus suburban areas. So there you go. Moving on to number 4. So kind of going off of that same discussion, number 4 says, which of the following technologies was the most likely contributor to the rapid growth of suburbs in the United States? So make the best guess here. Right? The one that makes the most logical sense is the one that's right. So it used to be where we pretty much had urban and rural, right? If you didn't live in the cities, you were in the country, right? Out in the boonies. But which of these technologies does it seem most likely contributed to rapid growth of suburbs? A, the telephone, B, the telegraph, C, the airplane, or D, the automobile? Which one seems to make most sense? Which one would lead to people living somewhere different? So the first 2 that I would throw out most quickly are the telephone and the telegraph, because they don't deal with transportation per se, right? Now, in today's day and age, you could maybe say that the telephone or certainly the internet may have led to more people living wherever they want because they can work remotely. But here, The one that makes the most sense is the reason suburbs became so popular was because all of a sudden everybody had what? An airplane? No, right? Everybody had a car. And you could live further away from the city and still drive into the city to work. So the right answer here is D, the automobile. Okay. And numbers 5 and 6 talk about this graph here. Zoomed out. Okay. Hopefully that's not too far zoomed out for you to see. All right, so number 5 and number 6 both refer to this graph, and the graph is titled World Population Growth Projection. Okay, so we see numbers here, right? So, but also notice down here in the key, these bars are broken up into white and shaded, right? The white bars represent less developed nations. Gray bars represent more developed nations. So years 2000, 2025, 2050, here's the projected growth of the world population, right? 2000 to 2025 to 2050. This is developed nations. This is less developed nations. So we can kind of see in general the trend. Okay, that said, let's look at our questions. 5 says, what does the figure 9, hold on, let me count all those zeros. 9 billion, 39 million represent? Okay, so this number here. So again, we don't see this exact number, but if we read the chart, we can see this graph is in millions, right? This number here is the closest thing I can find, right? 9,039. 9,039 million is the same as 9 billion. So that's what this number is telling us. So that's the first thing, right? If you can't make that connection, then you're going to be confused. The next step to answering this question is, once we find the number, what is that number telling us? What is this number representing? Okay. A, projected population of less developed nations in 2025. B, projected population of less developed nations in 2050. Or C, the projected population of more developed nations in 2050. D, the projected total world population in 2050. All right, so the first and easiest one to eliminate would be A, right? We can tell this number is dealing with the year 2050. So A is not. Okay. Now, B, C, and D all deal with 2050, but let's look closely at them, right? Notice we have 1, 2, 3 numbers. This number here represents the projected population of developed nations. This number represents the projected population of, I think I said less. This is more developed. This is the projected population for less developed. So what is this number? The answer is D. It's the projected total world population in 2050. All right, let's look at this last question. And I'll zoom out a little bit more. So again, hopefully you can still see it and read it. If not, I'll do my best to kind of explain it. But it says, number 6 says, which of the following conclusions is supported by the data on the graph? A, the total world population will double in the 50 years from 2000 to 2050. So let's just go through these one by one. If this is the total population in the year 2000, this is the total projected population in 2050. Is this number double this? No. A isn't right. Get rid of it. B, about half the world's population lives in the more developed nations. Okay. First of all, the less developed nations are projected to change pretty dramatically every 25 years, whereas the developed nations tend to stay the same. but I wouldn't say that this represents half of this, right? Clearly, less developed nations make up more, right? Percentage. So B isn't a conclusion that's supported by the graph either. So it's going to be C or D. So let's read through them and see which one makes the most sense. C, most of the population growth in the 50 years, from 2000 to 50, will occur in less developed nations. Or D, most of the population growth in the 50 years from 2000 to 2050 will occur in the more developed nations. So if you remember from last week, me talking about this, this is another one of those things where notice that the two that we're down to are worded exactly the same. Right? And typically when the GED throws you a question like this, where you notice a couple of the answer choices are exactly the same, except for, some of the words are flipped around. Like here, this one just has less developed nations. This one says more developed nations. That's usually a red flag that they're trying to hide the right answer, right? So keep that in mind. So let's look here. Which of those is true? Does most of the growth seem to be in the more developed nations or less developed nations? And we can see pretty clearly that developed nations tend to project as having roughly the same amount of people, whereas less developed nations tend to project having more people each 25 years. So the best answer is C. Most of the population growth in the 50 years will occur in the less developed nations. All right, so let's stop there for the day. Again, just a quick reminder, if you have been attending class for any amount of time, or either that or if you haven't taken a practice test since you've been enrolled, start taking practice tests. We really want you guys to get out there, take some tests, and see if you're starting to move in the right direction. And if you're not, then contact us and let us know what we can do to help you so we can get you to get moving towards getting your GED, right? And passing ultimately your social studies, right? So, and I'll keep harping on everybody daily just to make sure that we start doing that. And if you need help facilitating that, we are hoping to move towards being able to get some people to take practice tests in person as well. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we're close. So just we'll keep bugging you, but you keep asking us, right, for help. So with that said, I'll stop there for the day. I will be back at 1:15 with science, and Martin will have his reading class here at 12:15 coming up shortly if anyone wants to do that. So that's all I've got for you. I will talk to you later.